Okay. Thank you so much, Noam, for allowing us a little bit of your precious time. So, do you have any estimate of when is there stop the hard stop time? How much? How much?
Well, life is so impossible these days, I can't say.
Okay, no, okay, fine. And so please feel free to terminate it anytime that you would like to. I
Okay,
just make a,
I'll have to. There are other interviews all around the world. It's just
oh,
in.
fantastic.
Let's go on. Yeah.
It's really important to get your message and your analysis out there. I've got very good positive feedback from the last one from many people. So my guest today is once again Professor Noam Chomsky, and we are carrying out the second part of our interview. We started this 2 days ago, and we were unable to complete it because of technical difficulties. Professor Chomsky is a laureate professor of linguistics at University of Arizona. He's also the institute professor at MIT. He doesn't need any further introduction, and I will not waste his time any longer, and I will go right to the questions. There was a question, Noam, submitted by I guess somebody who attended the last session on the question of the biowarfare. Would you like to just answer that or not answer that at this point? And then,
what was the question?
okay, the question was, do you think the pandemic could have originated from a lab? And do you believe that the US, China, and other nations are engaging in effective biowarfare disguised under the so-called biodefense?
It's conceivable that the virus escaped from a lab. None of the labs are foolproof. But the idea that it was released, I think, is outlandish.
Yes.
So,
thank you. I was going to just start with foreign policy, but with the events in Philadelphia, and that it really sort of urged me to ask you something about the situation that we face now with racism in American society. And I believe that for the first time in recent memory, racism and racist behavior of police for the first time in recent history, it has become a central issue in the U.S. Presidential election. And as I just mentioned, only 2 days ago, the police murdered a Black person in front of his mother. What is your view of the situation? Are you concerned that race riots could take place in this country?
race riots have taken place all through the history of this country. I grew up in Philadelphia.
Oh.
I left Philadelphia when I was 20 years old. When I was a teenager, this is during the Second World War, there was a 7 p.m. curfew on teenage kids because there were race riots breaking out all over. I remember I used to go to Hebrew school in the evening. I had to have a special permit with me from my parents to be able to get on the subway in case I was stopped by a policeman. You know, that was, I mean, you read just even literature of those periods. James Farrell writing about Chicago, race riots all over the place. I mean, racism is deeply embedded in American society. What's happened, it's a kind of a poison, often right below the surface, but sometimes it breaks out. And Trump's genius has been to release it. He has skills. He knows how to tap all of the ugly, vicious, subterranean features in the society, and it's not only the United States, to bring them to the public, magnify them. And in fact, what's happened is an increase in visible tolerated white supremacy. At the same time, there's a countercurrent that's been developed for years of greater consciousness and concern about racial issues and white supremacy. You see this quite apart from Trump. So, for example, a year or two ago, the New York Times ran a significant series, 1619 they called it.
Yes.
That exposing the history of U.S. Racism since 1619. They picked that date because that was the date when the first official importation of slaves began. And they argued that this is a kind of a mainstream of American history. That wouldn't have happened a few years earlier but it's a matter of growing, developing, organizing activism, consciousness. We saw how it broke out during after the George Floyd murder.
Yes.
Spontaneous development, enormous social movement developed, black-white solidarity, enormous popular support, about 2/3 of the population. There's been nothing like this before. Well, that's the positive side. The negative side is there's a backlash, and it's stirred up consciously by the White House and his echo chambers in Fox News and elsewhere. And you even see it in statistics. Like take terrorism. The FBI, Anti-Defamation League, a couple of others keep regular figures. There's not a lot of terrorism in the United States, but it's there. When Trump came into office in 2016, white supremacy was, I think, about maybe 10% or so of American terrorism. Now it's close to 100%. It's gone up every year that Trump has been in office. Consciously stirred by the executive. That's how he sustains his voting base, by appealing to the most vulgar, disgraceful features of the culture and stirring them up. If we get rid of him, which is not obvious, to try to contain this poison and suppress it will not be easy. Once you let poison loose, it's not hard to contain. I think it'll have a long-standing effect on the nature of the society. It's kind of remarkable that a person of such monumental insignificance has been able to have such an enormous impact on the society. Part of it is his brilliance in knowing which kind of poisonous streams to tap. He understands that, and he does it brilliantly. You can see it in just about every speech.
Absolutely, that is so. What you're saying is so true. Another thing, Noam, is not part of the discussion, although you occasionally hear about it, is the fact that the United States has over 2 million people in behind the bars, and a huge number of them are African Americans.
Well, if you go back to 1980, pre-Reagan, you look at incarceration in the United States as compared with comparable countries, Western countries. The United States was within the spectrum. It was a little to the high end, but basically within the spectrum of Western societies. Now, probably 5 to 10 times as high. It's not that crime has increased. In fact, it's actually decreased. This is the result of racist policies. Lots of them. One of them is actually at the federal level is just the drug war. It's not the only one, but it's one. What's the drug war about? Well, it was actually initiated by Nixon, but it's worth remembering that Nixon was the last liberal president in the United States. So it was moderately humane, like other aspects of the Nixon administration. This is pre-neoliberalism. Nixon included in his drug war prevention and treatment, funding for prevention and treatment. Now, there have been studies, many ones. The Rand Corporation had a major one, studying just the cost-benefit analysis of different kinds of ways of dealing with drugs. Turns out by far the most cost-effective and humane. They didn't care about the humanity. They were looking at cost effectiveness, is prevention and treatment. Much less expenditure, much better outcomes. As the drug war developed, that's the one that has least funding, virtually eliminated. The most effective, the least funded. You take a look at police action to stop it, more expensive, less poorer outcomes, more funding. Take a look at border control, far more expensive, far worse outcomes, far more funding.
Mm-hmm.
Take a look at out-of-country activities, like devastating poor Colombian farmers by chemical warfare, which is politely called fumigation. I've been in southern Colombia in poor communities.
Mm-hmm.
See
Yes.
the effects. Everything's wiped out. You see poor farmers who developed a niche market in Europe for high quality coffee. Coffee's a very tough market. The planes come by, maybe they're Colombian, but it's basically US, and spray the crops. They destroy everything. Also, you have kids running around with sores on their arms and people dying and so on. That's the least effective and gets the most funding. It's inverse all the way across. And one of the effects is there's also radical disproportion in sentences. Some of it's famous. The rich executive snorts cocaine in his Westchester County home. It's first of all, nobody will go after him. But if they do, it's a light sentence. If some black kid is caught with a joint in his pocket, maybe it'll be the third strike and he'll go to jail forever.
Yes.
So this is a social, political crime. Doesn't have to happen. And it's basically part of the whole neoliberal assault on the population. It's essentially getting rid of disposable people. We're a civilized country. We don't just kill them. We send them to jail.
Exactly. Yeah, Clinton, Obama, Biden record on criminal justice is not very good. As we were talking about the incarceration rate, and a lot is perhaps attributable to the 1994 crime bill that I think you alluded to, the three strikes you are out thing. So now we reached a point, as you so correctly pointed out, that there is so much organizing. All these issues are absolutely in the front burner. So one would imagine that in a future potential Biden administration, then he will have to deal with these issues right away and in a serious way, especially doing something about the police violence on Black people. Would you agree?
Well, first of all, I think we should be careful not to fall into the trap, the establishment trap, of saying that elections and who's in office are the heart of politics. They're a small part of politics.
Yes, yes.
Real politics is the pressures that are being developed by popular activist organizations. That compels those in office to change the way they act. Not all. One of the cancerous elements of the Trump administration, which is off the spectrum in many ways, is that they're immune to popular pressure.
Yes.
They're stuck with their voting base. They want to cultivate it, don't care about anything else. So whatever the public wants or is doing, it's banging against closed doors. But that's never been true in the past. So take Nixon again. he was susceptible to public pressures on many issues. That's why he was the last liberal president. The same with Reagan. Like the huge anti-nuclear demonstrations in the early 80s were undoubtedly a factor in a number of his policies, including agreeing finally with Gorbachev on the INF Treaty, which Trump has dismantled. Aside from Trump, every political figure is susceptible to activist pressures. And the answer to your question is, will the public make him do it? Will there be real pressures on the administration to deal in a humane and sane fashion with the dramatic incarceration crime in the United States? They can't. Actually, it's worth remembering on the 1994 crime bill that the Congressional Black Caucus supported the bill.
Yes.
Because Black communities suffer from the increasing crime that's a consequence of the impoverishment, racism, and repression. It's a complicated cycle. Racism, deep racism, leads to Black communities living in deplorable conditions, which is crimogenic, creates crime. Then they want protection from the crime in their own communities. So you get a cycle which is kind of counterproductive, but perfectly understandable. It's kind of like, to take an example, actually there's a very good article today in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which describes one of the pathologies that's driving us, that may drive us to total destruction. That's the Minutemen. What they point out is that as what's called kind of like a sponge for absorbing incoming missiles, back in the 60s, ICBM missile bases were scattered all over rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
So in case there's an outbreak of war, they'll be wiped out instantly. They want it. So that's the interesting thing. The pressure, from a strategic point of view, they're senseless, totally senseless. They have no strategic value. They simply increase the threat that in a moment of crisis, the president will have to push the button. It's this use it or lose it story with ICBMs. They're all targeted certainly by Russia, maybe even by others. They know exactly where they are, they know exactly how to hit them and destroy them. So if there's a couple of minutes warning, you can't take chances.
Yes.
From a strategic point of view, they're a disaster. And just about every specialist wants to get rid of them. But the rural communities, which are the target, are organizing, in fact, massive lobbying with arms producers to keep them there, because it's a source of employment.
Yes.
You take the missile bases out, economy crashes. So here's totally suicidal. They're the worst victims. They want them. There's kind of a microcosm of that in the Black communities, that because of the circumstances of endemic racism and a long history of repression, they are in high crime areas. So they want police and incarceration, which harms them. I mean, these are non-trivial social problems.
I mean, is it that they sort of feel that 70 years have gone by, and although there were many close calls, but we avoided a nuclear exchange, and that there is no reason to believe right now that there would be something like that happening. So these silos are creating jobs.
You just put yourself in the position of someone who's living in one of these small rural towns scattered around the Midwest.
Right.
They hear from, first of all, they don't hear much, because it's never discussed. But they may pick up a story somewhere saying that rich elites in New York say we ought to get rid of these things, which is going to get rid of the church, the grocery store, the school where my kids go, and so on. So what's my decision? Why do I trust those guys anyway? They never do anything for me.
Yes.
So I don't trust them. They're just a bunch of pointy-headed elite intellectuals who think we're deplorables. So I'm not going to pay any attention to them. I'm going to pay attention to the things right around me. And I don't want my town destroyed because some rich elite guy somewhere says it's a strategic danger. What do I know about that? Okay, that's the mentality. And it keeps us driving on a course towards suicide.
Yes, I'm glad that you started talking about the nuclear weapons. That I know that is, of course, one of your major concerns now, along with the issue of climate change. And you spoke about the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the dissolution of that, rather, in the interview with Aaron Mate, and also the New START Treaty. So there is some good news, Norm, and that is, and I want to get your take on it, and that is the ratification, the 50th ratification of the TPNW, the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, and Honduras is the 50th country that ratified. So we have now the treaty going into force after the 50th ratification. 84 countries have signed it, so there are 34 still remaining to ratify. But the point I would just also point out, there are 109 other UN member states that have not signed the treaty, and they include all of the major Western states, except like Ireland and Austria and Liechtenstein, that have not signed it, and not a single nuclear weapon state, recognized or otherwise, has signed it. Do you think this ratification by Honduras is truly significant as far as disarmament goes?
It could be significant if, usual comment, if the public became organized to develop pressures to implement it. Now, there are interesting issues here. A couple of years ago, I haven't seen more recent polls, but about maybe 5 or 10 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, there were polls, extensive polls on the US population's attitude towards international agreements, towards the United Nations. And the results were pretty startling. Turned out that a majority of the population thought that the United Nations ought to take the lead in international affairs, not the United States, and that if the majority of the United Nations decided on some policy, the United States should follow it, even if we don't think it's in our interest. That was actually a majority of the population. In any elite circles, you can't even talk about this.
Yes.
It's so remote from anyone's thoughts. And these are people who never heard it. You can't find an article in the press, in journals, anywhere else, saying the United States ought to back off and follow world opinion on international issues. It's not even speakable in elite circles, but it was the general opinion of the population. And with the popular attitudes also held that we should give up the veto. Actually, Ben Page wrote a book a couple of years after this, which has a lot of data on these reports. Benjamin Page, media analyst. Forgot the name of the book, but it's an interesting collection of these data.
But its mainstream media is never mentioned.
Yeah, that shows opportunities, like a lot of other things that are never mentioned. I mean, we don't have formal censorship in the United States, but we have a system in which things of enormous importance are just kept from the public.
Yes, absolutely. There's a general question. I have been sort of mulling over it, that after the TPNW ratification by Honduras, that this whole business of what used to be quite frequently discussed in resolutions in the General Assembly and so forth, and that is the notion of nuclear disarmament to be accompanied by general and complete disarmament. Now, this notion has totally disappeared from the lexicon. And do you think that truly nuclear disarmament is possible without some sort of general disarmament, or that's a pipe dream?
Well, I think nuclear disarmament should be a very high priority because, for obvious reasons, if you know the history better than I do, you look over the history of the last 75 years, it's almost a miracle that we've escaped. There's been time after time when things became very close, dangerously close, sometimes a couple of minutes of decision making, often by accident, typically by accident, misinterpreting automated collection of data,
Yes.
sometimes as a result of reckless actions of government. But there are just too many cases. And the idea that you can live forever with miracles is pretty stupid. So yes, there ought to be very serious moves towards limitation and sooner or later elimination of nuclear weapons. It's not a wild idea. And it's been advocated, for example, by people like Henry Kissinger.
And you mentioned Bill Perry, of course, the other day.
Leading William Perry, leading figures in the weapons establishment. But general disarmament should go along with it. I mean, the amount that is spent in means of destruction is just shocking, especially when there are enormous human needs that have to be met. Now, that's not easy. Take, say, India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan are already at swords points over all kinds of issues. I just think a couple of years ahead. What happens in South Asia when the region is becoming almost unlivable under global warming?
Yes.
The rivers that provide water are declining. Two nuclear-armed states are struggling over how to divide up the diminishing water resources. You don't even want to think about it. And of course, if anything breaks out in South Asia, we're probably all doomed. Heavily armed nuclear states, conflict between them might bring about the kind of nuclear winter which would devastate everyone.
Yes, of course. No, that's the one thing, Noam, that your warnings about this Trump administration's near certain almost decision now, I think, not to extend the New START is so dangerous. On top of it, one thing that is quite unique, that even during the height of the Cold War, there was a hotline between Moscow and Washington. There was back channel discussions. Kissinger was doing the back channel before the ABM treaty that you mentioned the last time. But now there is no communication whatsoever, is what I understand, between at any significant level between Moscow and Washington.
It's part of the general breakdown of the system of international order. Forgotten whether we talked about this last time, but there was a dramatic illustration of it just a couple of weeks ago. The United Nations sanctions on Iran.
Yes.
Did you discuss this? Okay, don't repeat it. But
we heard you at Aaron Mate, not to the MIT audience. So please. Yes.
What happened? I mean, you could see it in the press, but didn't get the kind of reaction I thought it should.
Absolutely.
There are sanctions against Iran. In my opinion, they shouldn't be there in the first place, but let's put that aside. The United Nations sanctions were part of the JCPOA, the joint agreement, and they ran out. The United States has dismantled the joint agreement. The sanctions ran out. The United States wanted them to renew. It approached the Security Council, called on the Security Council to renew the sanctions. Total opposition. Not a single US ally agreed. In fact, the only country that agreed was Colombia, the US client state. The rest of the Security Council refused. So what happened? Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who comes right out of some gangster movie, Hollywood casting, literally, just look at him, came to the Security Council and told the members of the Security Council, sorry, you are reinstituting the sanctions, period. What can they do? If any European country says, you can't dictate to us what the Security Council does, they get tossed out of the international financial system.
Yes.
Which is run through Washington. Well, that's what it's like when the world is run like the mafia. And it's not that people are unaware of it. The main financial business newspaper in the English-speaking world is the Financial Times in London. Its most respected, distinguished columnist, Martin Wolf, so conservative, wrote a recent column in which he said, under Trump, the international order is in serious crisis, and if Trump is re-elected, it will be terminal. Terminal. That's not a voice at the fringe. That's a sober, restrained voice right at the center. That's what we're facing. And what happened at the Security Council is a case in point. The question of the New START treaty is another one. Trump has already dismantled the INF treaty, the Open Skies treaty, goes back to Eisenhower, threatened the use of, threatened nuclear weapons tests, hasn't happened for almost 30 years, and has been delaying on the New START negotiations with one after another frivolous objection. The Russians have been repeatedly asking, let's renew it, let's renegotiate it. And recently they just said, let's extend it for a year, give us some time. No, more objections. And now it seems that maybe there's some chance of a renewal. Has to come before February, but it's been delayed so long that it's very, very much at risk. And that's basically the end of the arms control regime. Trump has dismantled the rest of it. Actually, the first step was taken by George W. Bush, who dismantled the ABM treaty, but then Trump came along, everything. And there's something very striking about the Trump administration, very dramatic. He has nothing much in the way of policies, but there's one clear, definite policy. If any international arrangement exists that he didn't craft, it has to be destroyed. Notice the consistency. Everything. Just wrecking ball. I didn't do it, destroy it. If I did it, the greatest deal of the century. This is uniform. And it's the way it attacks Americans is astonishing. So a couple of weeks ago, Trump pulled out of the international consortium, COVAX, which is working on developing vaccines and on distributional issues, like trying to ensure that the rich don't take everything. international consortium. Americans benefit from that. I mean, it's perfectly obvious that the best way to develop vaccines is to work together. I mean, it's not even, can't even be a question. And the distributional problems are quite real. But he didn't create it, so we destroy it. The pretext for destroying it was that the World Health Organization is involved. We got to destroy the World Health Organization because Trump needs a scapegoat for his killing a couple 100,000 Americans through his incompetence. So we'll blame the World Health Organization, destroy that. There's a biodiversity conference in progress. I think about 160 countries. One is missing. The impact of loss of biodiversity is extraordinary. 40% of plant species have already been destroyed. Insect populations are sharply diminishing. Other species are being destroyed at extraordinary rate. The effect, quite apart from everything else, is an enormous effect for humans. But he didn't start it, destroy it. Okay, this is not, I should say, this is not unique with Trump, but he's carried it to an extreme. U.S. has pulled out of, has a ridiculous record on international treaties and agreements. It accepts almost none of them. And those that it does ratify have reservations, excluding the United States. This goes far back, but like everything else that's wrong with the system, it's been exaggerated by Trump to a lethal degree. And New START is another example of this.
One interesting thing about talking about all this, I mean, this kind of entails your discussions about the lack of rule of law and that we are really almost a pariah state when it comes to international affairs. But the interesting part I find is also that even between Democrats and Trump, Biden and Trump, when it comes to foreign policy, there is sometimes more hawkishness on the part of the Democrats. So if Trump wants to have a good relation with North Korea or Vladimir Putin, for whatever reason, the Democrats are opposing it. And Biden himself is a very strong interventionist. So this is, I think it's a problem. Do you agree?
Yeah. The problem is where it always is, the lack of popular activism to force the Democrats to abandon these crazed policies. But you're absolutely right. At the level of rhetoric, at least, there's not much difference. I mean, the Democrats probably wouldn't have destroyed the arms control regime.
Right.
And I don't know if they would have carried out the provocative actions that Trump is now implementing off the coast of China or off the borders of Russia, which is very dangerous. There are big problems in the South China Sea. China's doing things that are illegal and they shouldn't be doing.
Yes.
But you don't send the whole Pacific Fleet in there to try to show how tough we are. These are issues that require negotiation and diplomacy. And you're not hearing it from the Democrats. That's correct. But as we were saying before, they're at least susceptible to pressure if the pressure is there. If it's not there, it won't happen.
That is absolutely right. Because one example that you mentioned and is also I thought about is this assassination of Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani in Iraq. And you had said that this is really something so unprecedented, even since the Second World War, that you go and assassinate a major general in the Iranian government. And but there was, as you mentioned at that time, I heard you saying there was no protest from the Democrats.
In fact, you can trace this back to Abraham Lincoln, who made a powerful statement that that the assassination of a foreign leader, even if you're at war with them, is the worst crime. And states have lived up to that. During the Second World War, they lived up to it. You know, I mean, this breaks huge precedent. And in fact, just imagine that Iran, suppose that Iran had assassinated Mike Pompeo in an American high official, another one, in the Mexico City airport. Would we have thought that's fine? Well, that's what the United States did. I mean, it's outlandish. When you talk about the United States being an international pariah, it's also worth mentioning that there's a bipartisan consensus that the Constitution of the United States doesn't matter. It's very easy to show. Take a look at Article 6 of the Constitution. It says a treaty entered into by the United States has to be observed by all officials, all judges, everyone. Well, the main treaty that's been modern times, that's been entered into by the United States, is the United Nations Charter, the basic instrument of international law, post-war era, actually initiated by the United States. And take a look at Article 2.4. It says, the threat or use of force in international affairs is barred, with exceptions that are irrelevant. Okay. Does any American president live up to that?
Exactly.
I mean, first of all, they use force, but the threat of force is common. So every American president blithely violates the US Constitution, and you don't hear one word about it. From law schools, from international lawyers, political parties, and so on. Yeah, we want to throw the Constitution in the wastebasket, fine.
Yeah, this same issues came up again recently with Trump's decision to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and then the annexation of Golan and annexation of the West Bank as well, that Netanyahu was contemplating. And there was Chuck Schumer, who was openly supporting these decisions that are totally against United Nations resolutions.
Yes, explicit Security Council resolutions, which the United States voted for.
Yes.
Okay? But there's several of them. But it doesn't matter. It's us. We are the Godfather. We do whatever we like. In fact, this greatest deal of the century is quite interesting. Suppose that the plan, the sort of so-called greatest deal, which was actually written by Netanyahu, handed to Jared Kushner to bring to the public. Suppose any other country in the world had proposed it. Suppose China had proposed it, or Germany. People wouldn't even bother to laugh. It's a ridiculous, crazed plan, total violation of international law. Everybody in the world is opposed to it. If, say, Germany had proposed it, you wouldn't even bother to laugh. The United States proposes, it's the law. Everyone has to adhere to it. The immediate reaction to it was, well, how can we accommodate to this? Not, let's disregard it and throw it into the wastebasket where it belongs, but how can we accommodate it to it? That's the mafia. That's the international system. The Godfather runs it, and the Godfather's edicts have to be obeyed, and we don't even question it. It's just taken for granted. It's just like the sun rising. Okay, tells you a lot, not just about international order, but about the culture that lies behind it. Why isn't there an uproar about this? Why is it just automatically accepted? I mean, even if you're forced to accept it by the threat of US power, and countries are, you can still have vocal objection to it. You could have efforts to try to create counterforces. Like, does Europe have to allow the United States to run the world? It's got a bigger economy than the United States, educationally more advanced, uh, plenty of capacity to be an effective force in world affairs, subordinated to US power.
I was actually surprised by the the Security Council decision to not endorse the US proposal to snap back sanctions in Iran. I didn't think that the Europeans would have the backbone to actually do that. Were you surprised, or also do you think that is sort of harbinger of things to come?
Notice what they did. They didn't vote against it. They abstained.
Abstained, yes. Right.
They don't want to irritate the Godfather too much.
So they let the Russians and the Chinese take the blame. Okay. Yeah. And you also mentioned that the end of the arms control, because of the New START treaty coming, is not going to be extended. The other thing two other things, Norm, that I would like to bring to your attention is the crisis of the NPT, which actually you had alluded to in another interview, and that is the nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East, which creates this incredible existential problem, but also that it is going to be a major problem for the NPT renewal when it comes up for review, hopefully next year. And then there is the PAROS, the Prevention of Arms Race in Outer Space, that the US has been blocking. There is this whole new not new, they're very old in the sense that all these people who were in the saddle during the Star Wars are now back running the show at the Pentagon, and they don't want to have anything to do with arms control in space. I don't know if you have been thinking about those as well.
That's actually, you're quite right about the arms control in space. They want it. They don't want arms control. They want to develop space as an arena of conflict and potential destruction. More interesting, however, I think, is the nuclear weapons free zone. That's very interesting. Notice that both parties in the United States, Obama, Trump, Bush, have been for years claiming that the greatest threat to world peace is Iran and the Iranian nuclear programs. Well, that's actually nonsense, but let's accept it. Let's say it's true. Is there a way to solve that problem? Yes. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East with intensive inspections, which can work. They worked very well during the period before the Trump dismantled the joint agreement. Even American intelligence agrees. So, nuclear weapons-free zone with intensive investigation. Who's opposed? Not the Arab states. They've been vigorously pressing for this for 25 years. Not Iran, which strongly supports it, openly and strongly supports it. Global South, most of the world, 130 countries, vigorously supporting it. Europe supports it. What's the problem? The problem is bipartisan agreement in the United States. Every time it comes up for discussion, the US vetoes it. Most recent was Obama, 2015, NPT review sessions.
Yes.
Came up, Obama vetoed it. And it's coming up again, as you say, in a couple of months. The US will veto it, whoever's in office. Why? Very straightforward reason. It would mean inspecting Israel's nuclear weapon system. The US won't allow that. In fact, the US does not officially recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons. It's not a question, of course, it's perfectly open, but the US won't recognize it. There's a reason. US law, the Symington Amendment, The provisions require that U.S. military and economic aid has to be ended for countries that develop nuclear weapons outside the NPT framework. Neither political party wants to open that can of worms. So in order to protect the Israeli nuclear weapons and probably arguably illegal US aid to Israel, they're willing to face a major, what they call the greatest threat to world peace. This is pretty interesting. And nobody will talk about it outside the arms control community. You can't find a comment about it. I mean, it's been pretty interesting for me personally. I've been shouting from the rooftops about this for years. When you talk to an audience, they understand in 2 minutes. Can't go beyond. Nobody can say it. Try to find something saying, and we're willingly facing major threats, what we call the greatest threat to world peace, in order to protect arguably illegal US aid to Israel. If the general public understood this, there would be an outcry from all sorts of circles, including circles who, for terrible reasons, are opposed to foreign aid altogether. I mean, I think you'd have an overwhelming opposition to this across the spectrum. I think that's probably the reason it's never mentioned. Got to keep it secret from the public, because if they knew this, they might insist that we move on it. And that's against the interests of the lobbyists, the funders, the donors, that the two political parties obey, and that the intellectual community maintain silence about, because they're part of the act as well. This is a very broad problem.
Absolutely. It's very interesting, like what you're saying, that the stranglehold of the pro-Israel lobby on US politics on both sides of the aisle, so to speak. I think there is, I don't know, this is really something that you know so much about, is whether there is my question is whether do you sense a change in this total grip on American politics as a third rail, like you're saying, you cannot talk about it, because just the attacks that came down on Ilhan Omar, a first-term Sudanese or American congresswoman from Minnesota, and Rashida Tlaib from Detroit, that they went after these two people with like a big hammer, that made me think that they must sense that any kind of a breach would be dangerous.
Very much so. And remember, it's not just the two political parties. It's also the general intellectual community.
Yes.
I mean, have you read an article about this? I mean, it's transparent. Any teenage kid can understand it, but nobody will talk about it. The Iran nuclear weapons-free zone. Is there a change? Very definitely. And I think it's frightening people in power. If you look at public opinion polls, public opinion is shifting very sharply on this issue. You go back 10 or 20 years, the popular support for Israel was based primarily in liberal Democrats. Israel was the darling of the American liberals. That has been true since 1967. That's changed. By now, liberal opinion actually is even more favorable to the Palestinians than to Israel. Repeated Israeli crimes have undermined seriously liberal support. That's particularly true among young people, including young Jews, incidentally. Popular support for Israel has shifted to the far right, to right-wing ultranationalists, military elements, and the evangelicals. That's the base of popular support for Israel. So that those who are trying to maintain the traditional line know that they're fighting a dangerous battle. If popular opinion begins to affect policy, they're in trouble. Okay. And I think that's part of the reason, a large part, why there is such a total censorship on perfectly obvious things like overcoming the alleged Iranian threat by simply recognizing that Israel has nuclear weapons. You can't talk about it. And I think the reason is what you said. It's close to the breaking point.
Thank you so much. And Norm, I don't know if you are now totally rushed or if you have time for just two more questions.
Okay, let's go.
Okay. On the matter of election interference by Russia. So interference by Russia dominated the news ever since Trump's election in 2016. Democrats have been relentless in this effort, and we don't really know what really happened with those so-called Russian interference. But on the other hand, Trump is delegitimizing this election. Do you think that that's Trump's effort to delegitimize the election process is more of a threat than this some Facebook posts by some Russian troll or something?
By maybe a factor of 10,000. I mean, whatever the Russians are doing, I don't know. There have been some careful studies, even government commissions. Nobody can find a detectable effect. But even if there were, I mean, it doesn't begin to compare, say, with Israeli interference with American policy. It's not in the same. It's not even the same arena, and it's perfectly open. Like when Netanyahu didn't like the Iran deal.
Yes.
He was invited to a joint session of Congress.
Absolutely.
Where he was applauded by Democrats and Republicans for saying, your policies are all wrong, Obama's policies are wrong. Is that interference? Plus tons of other things. And all of this pales into insignificance in comparison with the interference in American elections by corporate and wealthy campaign funding. Absolutely. That has an overwhelming impact on elections. Is that interference? How about trying to destroy the post office so that it won't deliver ballots?
Yes.
Is that interference with American elections? What about purging voter lists to make sure that the wrong people don't vote? I mean, interference in American elections is overwhelming. Even if you could find something from Russia, it would be a straw on a mountain. And it's the Democrats who are pushing this.
Yes.
Just like the Democrats pushed the impeachment proceedings. Completely suicidal tactics. Anybody could have told them in advance, this is going to be a gift to Trump.
Yes.
For obvious reasons. Even if you can find something, it's going to be voted down in the Senate. So you lose. And then Trump gets up and says, I was vindicated.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if they're just totally incompetent, utterly stupid. The Russiagate, impeachment, whatever it is just a sign of their absolute inability to act politically, even in their own interests. It's, I can't understand. I can't understand a lot of things. Like a lot of
no. One final thing is about this election business. There was a book. It was a presentation at MIT 2 years ago. This young political scientist at Boston College, she did her dissertation on cataloging U.S. interference during the Cold War in other countries' elections, and more than just interference. And she documented at least 72 cases of such interference. And we hear nothing about this U.S. Continuing. Even during the Clinton administration, they threw out President Zelaya from Honduras. And there's just no mention of any of these.
take Bill Clinton and the Russian election of 1996, the U.S. intervened massively to try to ensure that their boy Yeltsin would be elected.
Correct.
And they were proud of it. It wasn't hidden. It was a sign of pride that it succeeded. But remember, the U.S. doesn't just interfere in elections. If it doesn't like the election outcome, it overthrows the government.
Yes.
That's a pretty serious intervention. In fact, just yesterday, the Chileans finally eliminated the Pinochet constitution. How did that get established? The U.S. overthrew the Allende government. It's not interference. We don't like it, we stick in a dictatorship. We don't bother with interference.
So the victory of in Venezuela, I'm sorry, not Venezuela, Bolivia.
Everywhere. In Venezuela, the United States supported a military coup in 2002, which overthrew the whole government. Not just the government of the United States. The New York Times, the liberal press thought it was wonderful. I mean, it was beaten back by the Venezuelan people in a couple of days. But when it took place, there was overwhelming support for it. That's our job, to overthrow governments we don't like. And of course, to interfere with elections.
Yes.
It's small potatoes.
Noam, do you have a final advice for the progressive community in particular, 6 days before the elections?
I think the main advice to keep in mind is that elections are a very small part of real politics. If you accept there is an establishment view which says the public has no role in the political system. Public has a function, show up every 4 years, push a button, and then you become what Walter Lippmann called spectators, not participants. As long as you accept that, we're in deep trouble. Real politics means continuing the activism and the pressures, the organizing, the educational activities constantly. Keep their feet to the fire, put pressures on, or nothing will happen. Okay, they'll just retreat back to the conservative, for the Democrats, the Clintonite, donor-oriented conservatives. Same everywhere. And public pressure works. We said it worked for Nixon, worked for Reagan, worked for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In fact, you remember he pleaded for it. He said, maintain the pressure or I'll never get anything through. That's politics. The left progressives made a terrible mistake when Obama came in. They abandoned everything. They said, we've got this wonderful guy, now let's put our faith in him. He had 2 years when he had control of Congress, betrayed the public badly, so badly that working people who voted for him switched to Trump within 2 years. It was not Trump then, the Republicans. Okay, do that again with Biden, you'll get the same thing. On the other hand, if you keep the pressure up, you can make changes. I think that's the main lesson should be kept in mind.
Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for giving me one more hour of your such precious time and this fantastic interview. We miss you in Boston, but please enjoy the sunshine in Arizona, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much again.